Good. Yes, I think we're live then. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Criticism and the Novel series. We're very happy to resume the semester with a very special guest, Professor Ilya Kliger. Professor Kliger is an associate professor of Russian and Slavic studies at the New York University, where he's also the director of undergraduate studies in the Department of Russian and Slavic Studies. Kliger specializes in historical poetics, a theoretical approach that we are unfortunately not very familiar with in Brazil, since we have no translations of Silovsky's work into Portuguese. We do, however, have a very interesting paper by Professor Kliger that was published in Portuguese some 2 years ago. We can share it with everyone later. More recently, in 2024, Professor Kliger has published the book Sovereign Fictions, Poetics and the Politics in the Age of Russian Realism by the University of Chicago Press, which is also the topic of Kliger's talk with us today. Welcome, Professor Kliger. Thank you very much for accepting your invitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Priscilla. This is a great pleasure and honor for me to take part in this project. I've had the chance to look at some of the YouTube presentations, which some of them were in Portuguese, and it limited my ability to understand. But such an interesting set of speakers, and I think quite a bit of maybe overlap in some cases when it comes to interests. So my hope today is to basically speak a little bit about the book, Sovereign Fictions, and at first just to introduce it briefly, and then to turn to a brief reading, a kind of case study drawn sort of in a way from the book, just to demonstrate how things work, how I understand Russian realism in the context of in its historical context. So yes, as you can see, here is a table of contents for the book, and judging by the subtitles of some of these chapters, I think it's possible to see that that there is a kind of polemical strain to the text, that there is an attempt to kind of address some of the main points coming from literary criticism and theory of the novel coming out of the Western European tradition, and sort of see how things may in fact be otherwise when it comes to the Russian tradition. This otherness is not meant by any means to indicate some kind of exceptionalism, but rather something else altogether. There's a sense that I have of a kind of unified field of sort of modern institutions to which the novel is responding, and various traditions seem to emphasize various aspects of it. And yeah, I wanted to see where and why and how the Russian tradition fits. So I have 3 points of departure for my discussion. Social imaginaries. The concept of social imaginary I find useful because it seems to me that it allows us to provide richer answers to the old historical materialist question of the relationship between literary form and social formations. This may be especially the case when it comes to literary realism, which is so obsessively preoccupied with experiences of sociality. My second point of departure is what I call civil society narratology. I will say a little bit more about each of these in a moment, but for now, I just wanted to say that there is a kind of consensus there seems to me to be a kind of consensus in literary scholarship, especially in theory of the novel scholarship, which tends to focus on the Western European tradition, somewhat more recently the post-colonial material as well. And the authors, the theorists with whom I engage in a kind of conversation throughout the book, often respectfully invoke Russian fiction but it never serves as a point of discussion for the theorization of the novel as a genre. And I think that there are certain drawbacks to this approach. So civil society narratology is, as I will say in a moment, I'll say more in a moment, is a kind of presupposed conception of narrative that emerges from the concentration on the sorts of traditions of the novel within which civil society imaginaries are very prominent. By contrast, what I am, the third point of departure is an attempt to ask the question of what happens to realist form when it enters into a social space within which the imaginaries of sovereignty are extremely prominent. So again, an attempt to grapple with, in historical materialist terms, with Russian literature's, 19th century Russian literature's most distinctive predicament, namely its attempt to practice realist social hermeneutics in the context of a very much intact old regime. Okay, so one by one, briefly, social imaginaries and the concept of social imaginary. I draw from Cornelius Castoriadis and Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor's somewhat more straightforward understanding, one that is easier to condense here, I provide on the slide. So Taylor writes, defines social imaginaries as the ways people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, the expectations that are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and images that underlie these expectations. He makes sure to distinguish between social imaginary and social theory, a prominent boundary that he wants to draw. I adopt the term imaginary here because, one, my focus is on the way ordinary people imagine their social surroundings, and this is often not expressed in theoretical terms, but is carried in images, stories, and legends. It is also the case that two theory is often the possession of a small minority, whereas what is interesting in social imaginary is that it is shared by large groups of people, if not the whole society, which leads to a third difference. The social imaginary is that common understanding that makes possible common practices and a widely shared sense of legitimacy. So, so much for social imaginaries. Again, it will come up in the discussion of particular texts and so on, and I'm happy to talk about the uses and disadvantages of the concept of social imaginary for literary criticism. Next, turning to the concept of civil society narratology, I am referring here to the tradition of theoretical work on the novel or on realist fiction more broadly, going back to Georg Lukács and Mikhail Bakhtin and forward to the most recent statements on theory of the novel that can be drawn from journals like Novel, a Forum on Fiction, and such like. And I argue that these theoretical works tend to rely on an understanding of the social horizon of realist fiction as delimited within the parameters of civil society dynamics. Now, what these civil society dynamics are, the critics tend to refer us to the social theorists, Gramsci, predominantly Antonio Gramsci, Louis Althusser, and Michel Foucault, all three of whom, and leading back to Hegel and to Hegel's groundbreaking analysis of civil society in the modern state. And out of this tradition, I extrapolate three basic ways in which civil society and its accompanying imaginaries are understood within within the corpus of European fiction. So One mode of aggregation is the aggregation of self-interest or the desire connected to the sociotope, what I call the sociotope of the market. Aggregation of desiring individuals within a market-like social world. So the protagonist is here imagined as a kind of homo economicus, an economic man in pursuit of desirable goods and people in competition, and also therefore in the relationship of interdependence with others, learning from others what is worth desiring as well. And I think the most prominent exemplar of this kind of mode of aggregation is a novel like the novel of Balzac, whose novels Lukács refers to in Hegelian terms as spiritual animal kingdom, referring to a concept from the phenomenology of spirit. I should say as an aside that an important text for me here is actually Hegel's philosophy of right rather than the phenomenology of spirit, which again I'm happy to talk about separately as a kind of extremely useful text in theorizing social dimensions of novelistic texts. That's this kind of suggestion that I make as somewhat of an aside in the book. So a second mode of aggregation of passionate individuals, disciplinary aggregation of passionate individuals whose enfranchisement into formal equality with others, so equality of rights, is based on their capacity for self-control. Only those who learn to govern themselves can dispense with being despotically governed, right? And this again, just to give I think this is a sociotope that is extremely prominent in Victorian fiction, 19th century Victorian fiction, and of course the kind of locus classicus here would be something like Jane Eyre, who is the novel that is preoccupied with the disciplining of passions. And then finally, the third mode of aggregation, the aggregation of common interest, which is an aggregation of questing individuals capable of recognizing their individual interests coinciding with the interests of others, and learning to pursue common interests as individual and individual interests as common. Here, the prominent example would be Goethe's Wilhelm Meister's apprenticeship, and specifically the model provided by the Society of the Tower. What we find in all of these cases, I argue, is the occlusion of the problem of politics itself, or of the occlusion of the concept of the state, or of the imaginaries associated with the state. By occlusion, I mean here that to some extent the texts themselves, and to a large extent also the criticism based on these texts, the theorizing based on these texts, tends to regard these questions, especially the question of state and politics, now somewhat narrowly understood as having to do with questions of the common good and of sovereign power. Those questions tend to be occluded, or which is to say regarded as less relevant to novelistic texture. And I want to give just one example, as is so often the case. Franco Moretti gives us a kind of paradigmatic formulation of this consensus in The Way of the World. So Moretti writes, the state embodies a mechanical and abstract form of social cohesion, intrinsically remote and foreign to the countless articulations of everyday life. This is why its exercise of power appears of necessity to be outside coercion, a force inclined by its very nature to be arbitrary and violent. Civil society appears, and here he is implicitly relying, I believe, on Antonio Gramsci's work, civil society appears instead to be the sphere of spontaneous and concrete bonds. Its authority emerges with everyday activities and relationships, exercising itself in ways that are natural and unnoticeable. Strictly speaking, within civil society, it is improper to speak of the exercise of authority as something distinct from the normal course of things. And this is all absolutely correct. And the point here seems to me to be that, the context for this statement is that is the question: why is the novel not interested in the state? Precisely because it is interested in these countless articulations of everyday life and personal relationships, and so on. So, okay, but my question is then, what happens when literary realism is called upon to grapple with its usual subject matter, which is to say these everyday interactions and private matters and so on, its usual subject within a social formation that is forcefully articulated to the political authority of the state. So in order to address this question, then I, in the book, draw on the output of 11 authors, all male, all gentry, all at one time or another employed in the service of the state. This is my corpus, and the point here is, of course, precisely to focus on the service elites and their experiences and the way in which they conceptualize the social world. And of course, this happens to be the social space out of which most of the production, novelistic and realist production of the 19th century comes from. So male gentry at one point or another employed in the service of the state, all more or less coming of age in the 1840s and 50s within the cultural field, whose status as state enlightenment project was being reasserted throughout the reign of Nicholas I. So as members of the service elite embedded within a tangled history of political collaboration and antagonism, the male gentry were positioned to interpret the social world around them with reference to figurations of the autocratic state. This estate habitus, a range of practical and representational dispositions acquired by virtue of being raised into belonging to a social group, is then reinforced by the pronounced dependence of the cultural field as such on political authority, yielding a set of preoccupations distinctive of time, place, and social position, and detectable in the lives and works of the authors at issue. So here's just a bit of about these preoccupations. The preoccupations can be said to converge on a social imaginary that foregrounds the figure of the state as the site of deep-seated ambivalence, the locus of harmonious togetherness and universal belonging on the one hand, and the source of coercion and illegitimate power on the other. On a case-by-case basis, this ambivalence could resolve in hostile withdrawal, in sympathetic critique, in protest, in rebellion, or in enthusiastic acclamation. Social position, in other words, did not determine a specific ideology narrowly conceived, but delineated a field of intensified symbolic activity. Regardless of the attitude ultimately adopted towards it, the figure of the state remained the compelling horizon against which the realist social hermeneutic was pursued. So this is my kind of constructivist, avant-gardist, but also, from my point of view, Russian formalist kind of attempt to picture, to imagine how what this might look like spatially. The idea here is that under civil society aggregation or self-realization in society, we have all of the standard novelistic topoi and motifs, and all of them are present in this corpus of Russian realist texts. So the individual who is naive, who is idealistic, who is passionate, may be alienated, socially often underdetermined, of middling means, provincial, arriving from abroad, and so on and so forth. Right? Again, a kind of standard novelistic individual. We have a social world that is also kind of a standard novelistic social world, more or less stifling, more or less conventional, more or less artificial, stagnantly antiquated, in some cases oppressively modern in others, that social world that stands over and against the individual. And then the standard motifs: introduction to modernity, socialization, path of development, Bildung, financial difficulties, marital infidelity, class course lovers, all of these motifs, right, are kind of set on edge by the kind of dominant, what I call, again, following Tynyanov, Yuri Tynyanov, constructive principle that arises from the social imaginary universe occupied by the producers of the text, so by scenarios and logics of sovereign power. Right. So the idea is not somehow that the novels are suddenly all about the state and all about sovereignty, but rather that there's a kind of warping, or again, to use formalist language, a kind of deformation that that material, the standard novelistic material, undergoes under the pressure of a different kind of social environment. Okay, so with this, I think I would like to turn to one particular example, one that would hopefully be familiar to the audience. I would like to give a very brief reading from the perspective here developed of two novels by Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment, and The Possessed, or The Demons, two late novels, famous late novels by Dostoevsky. But before I do that, I would like to say a couple of words and to set it up in a way that would connect the readings of the novels to the considerations that I have just outlined. So the point here would be to start with the claim that the relationship between Russia's cultural elite and the imperial state is structured by the perpetual possibility of the kind of dramatic encounter with sovereign power that the young Fyodor Dostoevsky experienced one cold December morning in 1849, as he stood in a group of political prisoners, members of the Petrashevsky Circle, the early socialist Petrashevsky Circle, condemned to execution by the firing squad. If one examines the official documents linked to the execution, one can easily come to the conclusion that it was conceived as a large-scale theatrical production, intended not only for the display of what Michel Foucault has called sovereign superpower, but also for the display of this superpower's supersession, the staging of the Tsar's clemency or mercy in dramatically commuting the death sentences to various periods of Siberian hard labor. So sovereign power appears here on stage to us in its realization of both sides of Foucault's formula, not only as the power to take life, but also as the power to let live. And considerations on clemency or pardon within political philosophy are many. I would like to bring one particular text, not a theoretical text, but a literary text, which was in part because it's quite vivid and will be relevant for the discussion that follows, but in part also simply because Dostoevsky is known to have loved it. This is the Pierre Corneille's tragedy Quina ou La Clémence d'Auguste, Quina, or the clemency of Augustus. And Dostoevsky, in a letter, 1840 letter to his brother Mikhail, describes it very enthusiastically, and in particular points out this passage. I apologize for we had to at the last moment change the format, and so this one is a bit off, but I will nevertheless try to read it. This is the scene in which Augustus, soon to be currently emperor, first emperor, is forgiving political criminals Quina and Émilie, and thereby establishing a stable political order in Rome. This is what Augustus says: "I'm master of myself, as of the world. So not only of the world, but also of myself. I am, I wish to be. O days to come, preserve forever my last victory. Right. So history will remember this last victory and the triumph. I triumph over the most righteous wrath that ever can be handed down. That ever can be handed down to you. Kina, he says, let us be friends, this I entreat. So he forgives Kina, he offers friendship to a political criminal. Dostoevsky is very, very impressed by this, and this is, of course, an example again in discussions of this show, right? That pardon or clemency is a higher instantiation, still higher instantiation of sovereign power than execution or torture. Again, there are issues here that I will mention later on. So Dostoevsky's confrontation with the monarchy at its most intimate, at this moment when he believed that he would die at the hands of the monarchy, does not end with the theater of execution and clemency on the public sphere. The genre changes, no longer a kind of theatrical, grand public theatrical performance, but the stakes remain. And I have in mind here some of his least studied texts, least well-known texts, for understandable reasons, namely two patriotic odes that Dostoevsky composed in Siberia and addressed to members of the royal family as offerings of repentance intended to speed up his return to the capital and, more importantly, his access to his livelihood, to publishing. I will not go into the detail, much detail about the odes themselves, but do want to remark that the proper quote-unquote social environment or social imaginary horizon, what again the formalists called literatury byt, literary everydayness of a text like this, can be thought of as, of course, as obsolete, right? So it invokes nothing like the literary market that comes to dominate in the 19th century, nor anything like the salon, somewhat earlier form, but rather court literature and state patronage, a regime in which serious works are called upon continuously to acclaim the charismatic aura of the sovereign. And indeed, the odes contain multiple images of royal charisma here, consistently conflating the stately with the divine. The poems draw on the high classicist lexical register, framing the image of the recently deceased Tsar Nicholas I with the help of the traditional topoi of divinization. So Nicholas I is here presented as a solar deity, so a kind of royal sun figure, S-U-N, the fearsome archangel with a fiery sword. His grave is depicted as holy or saintly. His deeds are immortal. He is a god who is known through his deeds. He is also an object of conversionary faith on the part of the formerly schismatic and blind lyrical persona of the criminal Dostoevsky. Finally, the heir to the throne, the future Alexander II, makes an appearance as the savior, Christ himself. The second poem casts him as, quote, our Tsar in a crown of thorns, and both the newly crowned ruler and the Christian savior are united in their capacity for what the lyrical persona badly needs, namely all forgiveness. Dostoevsky finds these topoi in the vast depository of politico-theological ideas and scenarios, at times refracted through the tradition of courtly poetry, going back to at least the beginning of the 18th century. So the scholars Boris Uspensky and Viktor Zhivov have shown in their classical study Tsar and God the sacralization of monarchical power in Russia up until the 15th, this conception, let me just quote and then comment on it. The conception of the Tsar's special charismatic power fundamentally altered the traditional notion of royalty, as the juxtaposition of just and unjust Tsar now became that of genuine and false Tsar. And I think here we have a kind of kernel, a way into some of the central issues of Dostoevsky's poetics, as well as the poetics of a number of other authors that I discuss in the book. The point here that Uspensky and Zhivov tried to make in this article is that prior to the 17th and especially 18th century, the identification between Tsar and God could only be a kind of metaphorical one, and it was clear that it was figuratively the two are figuratively compared, and the infinite difference between the earthly Tsar and the heavenly Tsar is emphasized. But with the arrival of the eschatological framework of the doctrine of Moscow as Third Rome, and emerging in the wake of the fall of Byzantium and the Florentine Union, resulted in the ascription to the ruler of the only remaining Orthodox kingdom of a messianic role. This accrual of charismatic power to the monarch allows later rulers to project even their excesses, so excessive cruelty, excessive violence, and so on, as confirmation of their superhuman status. Anticipating one of the prominent images of royal charisma to which Dostoevsky resorts in his Siberian Odes, as well as elsewhere, there emerges in his novels, there emerges the epithet righteous son, son of righteousness, formerly used only in liturgy to refer to Christ, is now applied to legitimate rulers, but also to pretenders to the throne. One of the very central issues that arises with this shift from the conception, the traditional conception of royalty and the new modern conception of royalty is the shift from the idea of the difference between the just and the unjust Tsar now becomes, so in other words, the difference between the Tsar who obeys divine commandments and follows traditions righteously and one who doesn't, now becomes the question of the genuine or the false Tsar. And this question can only be fideistically, so by faith alone, decided. So let's see in a moment how this plays out in Dostoevsky. The Siberian Odes then testify to the fact that Dostoevsky has thoroughly assimilated the imaginaries of sovereignty as they developed within the local tradition of political theology. As such, they continue what, at least on the scale of Dostoevsky's biography, began on the day of the execution, the unfolding of the scenario elevating the ruler to great charismatic heights through the display of mastery over life and death, as well as through the odic acclamation and sacralization of the ruler. Of course, given the accumulated genre memory both of executions and of odes, patriotic odes, it is not surprising to find such a robust substratum of political theological motifs in them. But how would such a substratum enter into and interact with the generically hostile environment of the novel? So, put another way, could imaginaries arising within the regime of sovereignty produce a kind of mutation within the novelistic form? And this is what I will try to discuss now by turning to Crime and Punishment and Demons in particular. So the last two late novels by Dostoevsky, where the political theological problematic is most richly elaborate, are these two novels, probably. Although it's everywhere. It's in the Brothers Karamazov and elsewhere as well. In broad terms, both of these novels fall into what might be called the life of the great sinner paradigm, which refers to a novel that Dostoevsky projected but did not complete, The Life of the Great Sinner, entitled The Life of the Great Sinner, planned out in 1869, 1870. The novel is unwritten, but the notes prove to contain something like a meta plot or a kind of mythos for the last three novels Dostoevsky would complete, as well as anachronistically to the earlier Crime and Punishment. The central plot arc of this quasi-hagiographical tale consists in the account of a turbulent sinner's path to moral regeneration. At the core of the narrative is the notion that one's capacity to go far in the direction of sin indicates a capacity, a comparable ability to rise high in righteousness. Thus, what is emphasized in The Great Sinner is the quality of elemental strength, or elemental vital strength, or immediate elemental vital strength. I'm struggling to translate the Russian term непосредственная животная сила. The elemental strength emerges as the more fundamental category than sin or virtue itself. The great sinner has been elected for greatness, and that greatness is his natural endowment, and it can manifest itself both in sin or in virtue. The slightly paradoxical ring of the phrase itself, great sinner, indicates that ethical considerations don't altogether overrule ontological ones. So the positive connotations of the adjectives are not drowned out, great are not drowned out by the negative denotations of the noun, sinner. Conversion from sin to virtue, from blindness to faith, may or may not take place in these 5 novels that he is going to write. So there's presumably a conversion from blindness to faith occurring in Crime and Punishment, not so much in Demons. But for the time being, we are presented with a series of dramatizations and images of charisma, the aura of superior power, which allows the great sinner in the notes to say, I myself am God. The representational priority of ontological categories, greatness, mediocrity, power or weakness, intensity of tepidness, over ethical ones, virtue, sin, corruption, kindness, probity, corruption, kindness, cruelty, and so on, is central, again, to a certain strain within political theology. Behavioral excesses, as I already pointed out, mark the identity of the ruler more explicitly than obedience to customs, to ethical norms, or religious prescriptions. This, in turn, places a greater burden on the mechanism of self-representation on the part of the ruler and faith acclamation on the part of the subject. The question of the sovereign's identity cannot be resolved once and for all according to a pre-existing standard. This is why someone like Peter the Great may appear as God or Christ to some of his subjects and as an idol or antichrist to others. The identity of the ruler is established by faith. In both novels I'm discussing, the accrual of charisma proceeds along these political theological lines. Dostoevsky tests himself against the paradigm of foundational politics, represented by the figure of the great lawgiver. The lawgiver is at the same time a criminal, who, in introducing new laws, spurns the laws of his fathers. The lawgiver, and Raskolnikov mentions here Lycurgus, Solon, Mohammed, Napoleon, acts from the place of normative exception and thus transcends ethical considerations, manifesting himself as a kind of higher, more intense being. The zone of indistinction between crime and foundational act is illuminated during Raskolnikov's walk to the apartment of the old pawnbroker he intends to murder. So here, as he walks, instead of plotting the murder itself, he entertains plans for architectural remodeling of St. Petersburg. So specifically expanding the summer garden to include the Field of Mars and the garden of the Mikhailovsky Palace. Actually, the plan happens to coincide precisely with Peter I's original design of the city. Peter I's presence or absence, or present absence in in the novel is worth commenting on, because of course Peter himself could not appear in the final version of the novel, in the published version of the novel, because censorship would never allow a conflation or a kind of comparison between a Romanov, member of the Romanov dynasty, and a murderer, let alone a murderer who supposedly models himself on Peter. But if we look at the notes to the novel, Peter appears as often, if not more often, in them than the well-known model Napoleon. I could say more about how Peter appears and so on if there's interest. So within the imaginary regime of sovereignty, the conflation between violent crime and the layout of the imperial capital ceases to sound like a mere detail from criminal psychopathology and emerges instead as yet another element in the coding of the crime as a foundational political act. In a similar vein, the entire central intrigue of the demons, and here I would be very curious if anybody knows of another example, whether from 19th century or from later text, where the intrigue of the novel would be a question of whether or not somebody will become the czar, right, or the kind of ruler of a country. So in a similar vein, the central intrigue of demons hinges on whether or not the novel's protagonist will agree to be installed as Russia's new czar once the unstable contemporary Russian society finally collapses. So it's nothing, quote, "It's nothing for you to sacrifice life, your own or someone else's," acclaims Stavrogin's grotesque sidekick Petrusha, right? In order to demonstrate to Stavrogin that he indeed should accept the role of the Tsar. You are a leader. You are a sun, once again, the star, the sun as the star, and I am your worm. At another point in the text, the ardent nationalist Shatov cries in disappointment, and this is Nikolai Stavrogin's great exploit, to which Stavrogin replies, echoing Petrusha's later acclamation, "Forgive me, but you seem to look upon me as some sort of sun." So the royal emblem of the sun, the sovereign as the solar deity, already familiar to us from the Siberian odes, also appears in Crime and Punishment during the third conversation between Raskolnikov and the investigator Porfiry Petrovich. Urging Raskolnikov to embrace punishment, the investigator exclaims, "What matter if no one will see you for a long time? Become a sun and everyone will see you. The sun must be the sun, first of all." Thus, Raskolnikov is not Raskolnikov is not alone in drawing on the register of sovereign charisma for means of self-definition. His ostensible nemesis, the investigator, also, despite layers of novelistic equivocation and irony, sees him as an extraordinary man. The protagonist's charismatic aura is further reinforced by Christological associations. And the Christology here is not one of kind of narratives of meekness and self-loving sacrifice. Rather, the focus is, when it comes to Christ, on motifs of enigmatic identity, miracle-wielding exceptionalism, resurrecting, for those who've read the novel, right, resurrecting Lazarus, miracle-wielding exceptionalism, sovereignty over life and death, and capacity to rule and redeem. Stavrogin, whose very name is derived from the Greek for cross, is not only cast as a sovereign or impostor sovereign, but also as a messiah or false messiah. Raskolnikov is repeatedly associated with Christ. Again, such invocations of political-theological charisma may be thoroughly unsurprising in a patriotic ode or in a tragedy, of course, but it may be expected to trouble the more traditional representational strategies of the novel. One simple instance of such a disturbance can be detected at the level of Raskolnikov's motivations for the murder. Right. So here, more can be said, but I just want to very briefly outline what I mean by this. On the one hand, the murder is a test for Raskolnikov's capacity to withstand the power over life and death, this kind of miraculous power whose deep-seated political theological referent can be located at the conflation between the figures of Peter I and Christ. On the other hand, the murderer is also endowed with more mundane, more properly private or social motivations. His family is poor, his sister is potentially betrothed to a despicable man, Raskolnikov needs to make a career, certain contemporary ideas are circulating in the air like utilitarianism, and he is imbuing him, right? And so there are these two planes, roughly speaking, the kind of traditional novelistic plane and this odd presence of yet another kind of layer here. So the central act of the novel is committed at the point of intersection between two imaginary regimes, the regime of sovereignty, asserting ultimate miraculous power over life and death, on the one hand, and on the other, the properly novelistic regime of social aggregation and normalization. So within this novelistic regime, what we find is the idea of that the sequence is transgression, social exclusion, and eventual reintegration, right? And so the novel is often read in this way, where what's at stake is, Raskolnikov's reintegration back into society. But of course, right, this reading clashes with a whole set of issues that I will mention in a moment. The second site at which the representational regime of sovereignty traverses traditionally novelistic social everydayness marks the distinction between the private and the public domain as it is understood in the text. This is vividly rendered during a scene depicting an exchange between Raskolnikov and the police clerk Zametov. The two of them meet accidentally at a tavern where Raskolnikov has stopped by to look for accounts of his crime in newspapers. Again, a kind of curious thing that he does. Zametov sits down next to him and starts a conversation. Raskolnikov taunts the clerk while gradually implicating himself until he is on the verge of admitting his guilt. And here is a kind of classically Dostoevskian scene. A terrible word was trembling on his lips. Another moment and it would jump out. Another moment and it would let go. Another moment and it would be spoken. And what if it was I who killed the old woman? And Lizaveta said, he said suddenly, and came to his senses. Zametov looked wildly at him and went white as a sheet. So it's possible to read this scene among similar others in which Raskolnikov comes close to exposure, to exposing himself, as an index of his conflicted desire to be apprehended. According to this interpretation, which I think arises by default within the horizon of novelistic psychosocial normativity, having committed the crime, Raskolnikov cannot bear the weight of guilt and isolation it imposes on him and begins to seek out exposure and punishment. The trouble with this interpretation is not only that Raskolnikov's feelings of guilt are explicitly ruled out, even to the very end, even in the epilogue. The deeper issue here is that it covers up the construction of the episode as a kind of scenario of power in which a witness is called upon to gaze spellbound at the hero who flickeringly manifests himself as a godlike master of life and death. In other words, Raskolnikov's act of self-revelation is doubly implauted. On the one hand, we have a violation of a law committed by a private person, and this must remain hidden if the protagonist is to avoid getting caught. On the other hand, we have a crime as a pivotal point in a certain scenario of power, the sovereign's power to take life and let live. which must, by definition, be performed in the open, publicly establishing the identity of the actor through the act. It therefore, in straightforwardly psychological terms, we might say that the crime, thus conceived, produces in the protagonist the contradictory desire at once to remain hidden, following the pull of the novelistic, the criminal plot, and not so much to get caught as to always be seen, right? This is why the crime should be in the newspapers. The interaction of these two codes, sovereignty and socialization, they might be called, forms the dramatic kernel of the extended exchanges between Raskolnikov and the investigator Porfiry Petrovich. The encounters trace the investigator's struggle first to understand and then to realign the very structure of the protagonist's subjectivity, including, and perhaps most prominently, his sense of time. So, in Foucault's terms, Porfiry appears here as a paradigmatic disciplinarian, less concerned with apprehending the criminal than with observing and trying to understand him, less driven to establish his formal identity, but which he already has, than to get to the core of his way of thinking, less preoccupied with punishment than with correction and reform. Put another way, the investigator anchors the techniques and voices the values traditionally understood as novelistic: psychic transparency, the omniscient gaze of the author or reader, malleability under the pressure of social interactions, right? The hero should be malleable, openness in biographical time, and so on. Meanwhile, the protagonist adheres to a set of opposing or incommensurable imaginaries associated with the regime of sovereignty. A vision of the subject as a mysterious source of exceptional norm-destroying deeds that are on display for public viewing and acclamation, and thus establish, test, and fortify the identity of the doer as sovereign. Equally telling in this respect are the agonists' competing notions of time. Porfiry is once again on the side of the novelistic impulse to see individuals as mobile and fluid, and ultimately biographical, insisting that confession and imprisonment would not empty Raskolnikov's life of meaning, but rather there's more, he's still young, he should be more patient, and so on and so forth. So for the investigator, for Raskolnikov, on the other hand, the crime is the act, the moment of truth, the ordeal, or the test of his calling to sovereignty. If he fails, he might as well not be alive. Here, identity is given once and for all. It may be tested but never changed. Somewhat schematically, then, we might say that the titular crime of the novel and the enigma of identity to which it gives narrative foundation can be specified as a site of generic interference, internalizing the mutually contradictory imaginaries of disciplinary sociality on the one hand and sovereign power on the other. The protagonist is both ordinary, socially uprooted, novelistic, and extraordinary, endowed with a political theological aura. Here, the traditional 19th century novelistic motif that might be designated as the young man in the city is traversed by what might be regarded as the alien and antiquated motif of ritualized performance of absolute authority and its acclamation, the motif of the Son of Righteousness. The latter carries with it into the novel a set of distinctive narrative logics, such as the emphasis on the moment of truth, the scenes of acclamation, scenarios of power, dualistic or ambiguous rather than fluid identity. I mean by this by dualistic or ambiguous, I mean, is he the Messiah, or is he the false Messiah, is he the true sovereign, is he the false sovereign, impostorship, and so on, rather than fluid identity within biographical time. So turning now to the demons, the stakes of Stavrogin's identity are heightened through the placement. Those of you who've read it will remember that the novel is set up in Stavrogin's absence. This entire social world is depicted to us as fragmented, contradictory, full of tensions and problems and enigmas, and the entire kind of set of relationships is zeroed in on the question between the people involved in this town, between the people living in this town, and between them internally with themselves. Their relationships to themselves are all focused on the identity of the protagonist. So the flimsy show house of society, as Petrusha calls it, will surely collapse, and the moment of truth is upon us, and the drama unfolds around the identity of the hero, sovereign, redeemer, whose legitimacy or impostorship must perpetually be in question. So Stavrogin's chosenness as such, his election for leadership, is acclaimed or disclaimed by everyone around him. Even members of the older generation indulge in such similarly ambiguous speculations. For example, his Stavrogin's former tutor, Stepan Trofimovich, suggests that Stavrogin's scandalous behavior could be explained by analogy with Shakespeare's Prince Harry from Henry IV, Part 1 and 2. The invocation of the Henriad is significant here precisely as a precedent for exploring the problem of legitimacy. Henry IV, in particular, traces out the consequences of Bolingbroke's usurpation and indirect murder of the divinely ordained King Richard II. Prince Hal's carousing with vagabonds is explicitly cast as his father's punishment for the perhaps necessary transgression. The political theological essence of the punishment consists in the production of uncertainty about whether or not Bolingbroke's new established royal line is divinely acceptable after all. The question that is raised by the drama of legitimacy and pretendership pertains to the enigmatic absence of sovereignty as such. And I'm beginning to conclude this presentation. Raskolnikov, in a farewell letter to one of the many women who love him, Stavrogin writes, "I've tested my strength everywhere. The testing for myself and for show proved it, my strength, to be boundless. In front of your eyes, I endured a slap from your brother. I acknowledged my marriage to the lame and mentally disabled woman publicly." The motif of the test of strength, already familiar to us from Crime and Punishment, returns here with the added emphasis on a dimension of publicity or for show. Raskolnikov tests his strength with murder, feels humiliated by the need to hide what he has done, and seeks out ways to put himself on display. Stavrogin tests his strength repeatedly and directly in public, posing riddles that attract the almost mystical fascination of the other characters and the narrator himself. What happens to be for show here is the capacity to spurn the opinions of those to whom this capacity is being demonstrated, is being shown. What the public witnesses is the power that rises above the public, utterly transcends it, and constitutes a state of exception in its midst. The first of the two episodes Stavrogin mentions is worth looking at a little bit more closely. This is a moment when his disciple Shatov, his former disciple Shatov, comes up to him in the middle of a gathering and delivers a blow to his face. The episode is set up as a culmination of a long, nearly 50-page sequence, and as a kind of dramatic pinnacle of this sequence. Shatov walks up to Stavrogin. A hush settles over the room. Shatov strikes with all his might. Someone cries out. Everyone freezes, and then there's silence. And in this silence, there's a kind of dilation of the dramatic moment and insertion into this moment of an odic exemplum, an extended digression describing a precedent for the hero here being acclaimed. This is the famous Decembrist Mikhail Lunin, completely reckless in war and peace alike, capable of challenging anyone to a duel, but also serving the verdict of life and penal servitude for making, in 1816, making regicidal plans. So the digression concludes with the narrator's assertion that he has always considered Stavrogin to be the sort of man who would kill an offender on the spot without even challenging him to a duel. And Stavrogin is here yet again, yet another display, another scenario of power. The Stavrogin here is expected to kill Shatov, or at least to do something else horrible, maybe challenge him to a duel at best, but he does nothing. This is totally unexpected. And the narrator dwells here on the scene of self-mastery, comparing Raskolnikov's ostensible feelings in the immediate aftermath of the blow to those of a man clutching a red-hot bar of iron. I'm sorry, just one moment. I lost myself. We are thus reminded of Dostoevsky's favorite scene from Kina, the staging of Octavian's capacity to master his righteous rage at the act of sovereign, as in the act of sovereign pardon. Traditionally, the ruler's self-mastery, especially mastery over rage, functions as an index of legitimacy, and in Corneille, it is indeed the act that founds stable and legitimate rule in Rome. Stavrogin's scenario of power, on the other hand, serves to deepen the charismatic mystery, which projects the self-limitation of power as a mark of boundlessness. The trouble is that the power is limited here by nothing outside the self, no idea or ideal for the sake of which the ruler chooses to limit his capacity for violence exists. So what Stavrogin lacks, according to his own confession in a letter that I invoked before, is precisely what he calls великодушие, which is the term that goes back to the French neoclassical tragedy, générosité, or magnanimity, a dedication, in other words, to a principle that stands outside and, as it were, above one's own self. Like Raskolnikov, who has no new word with which to legislate, but is preoccupied with his capacity alone to legislate, so Stavrogin embodies the drama of pure power beyond all determinations, beyond the distinction between legitimacy and pretendership. The drama, in other words, of sovereignty itself. So just a couple of words in conclusion. The comically blind to the real stakes of Stavrogin's journey, members of the older generation and demons expect much from this handsome, promising young protagonist. They hope that he will one day stop behaving so strangely, come to his senses, marry a beautiful heiress, and become a brilliant member of society. These properly social hopes do not simply go unfulfilled. They are invoked only to highlight their ultimate irrelevance, their pettiness, by comparison with the novel's more authentic preoccupations. As we have seen, these preoccupations are, in both novels, better understood as political, or more properly, political theological, for grounding scenarios of power, acts of norm transgressive violence, scenes of acclamation, scripts of exception, and mysteries of charisma. These novels thus appear to draw upon the imaginaries of sovereign rule at least as much as, if not more than, those of civil society, belying the consensus view of the novel as the genre of sociality par excellence. The notion that the novel, in order to be a novel, must be preoccupied with the negotiation of the boundaries between individual desire and social cohesion, a notion from Nancy Armstrong, or that the novel predominantly concerns itself with the sphere of spontaneous and concrete bonds, from Moretti, or that its notion of power, the novel's notion of power, is subtle rather than brute, from Foucault and D.A. Miller, commentator on Foucault and theorist of the novel, all these notions encounter a stumbling block in Dostoevsky, and as I argue in other texts as well. So the question is why, and when we come to understand to understanding why that may be the case, three concentric explanatory horizons seem relevant. The first, in regard to Dostoevsky, is simply the narrow horizon of his own ideological commitment, which is, of course, on the other hand, shared by many of his contemporaries. Commitment to an idealized version of the monarchy as the political form most proper to the aspirations of the Russian people. The symbiosis of the people and the Tsar leaves no room for the intermediation of society, understood here as more or less disciplined aggregation of self-seeking individuals. Within this model, the Tsar is one in whom, as in the famous frontispiece to Hobbes's Leviathan, the many are contained. Or, as he writes in his writer's diary, for the people, the Tsar is the embodiment of itself. Insofar as the many are a chosen people, the one is their Messiah and earthly God. This is the vision Dostoevsky offers already in Siberian Odes, and it opens out into a broader horizon now, the horizon of his experience as a writer in 19th century Russia. And here, extensive problems with censorship aside, this experience spans the extremities of stage execution and exile at one end of the spectrum, and on the other hand, towards later in his life, an association with royal family and the affairs of the state. So, coercion on the one hand, collaboration on the other hand, there is a continuum there. The point to emphasize, again, is not so much that we're dealing with either coercion or collaboration, but rather that we are constantly in this state of intimacy with sovereign power, intimacy that could, with comparable probability, break a life or endow it with high meaning. So in this respect, Dostoevsky's experience may have been among the most breathtaking to contemplate the execution, the scene of the execution, but it was certainly closer to paradigmatic than to exceptional. Paradigmatic too, and here we reach the third and outermost horizon, because his life and work unfolded in a world in which civil society and its corresponding social imaginaries remained in abeyance, while the autocratic state had taken a firm hold on the imagination of the literary elites on both ends of the political spectrum. Traditionally, the separation of civil society as the domain of private property, market relations, and formal equality from the political domain of the state involves the privatization of literature with regard both to its institutional structure and its subject matter. And from this point of view, the modern novel takes the lead in this process and encodes it most forcefully in its private reading practices and its private themes. What happens then once the novel crosses over into a social space within which institutional autonomy remains precarious, and literature in particular is deeply imbricated in the workings of the state? Most broadly formulated, the hypothesis that animated this discussion was that on the basis of the distinctive institutional position, a prominent social imaginary develops that is atypical for the 19th century novel. It is an imaginary that tends to elude the standard realist problematic of pacification and accommodation of individuals within civil society, and to focus instead on dramas of sovereignty. The question of how these dramas play out in the work of other 19th century writers is the preoccupation of the book as a whole. Here, I can only suggest that when it comes to the prevalence of the imaginaries of sovereignty, Dostoevsky's work, much like his biography, presents what may be an especially vivid case, but certainly not an exception. Thank you.
We're back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ilya. It was great to hear you after having read your book and your papers. I mean, and I think it was very interesting for our, as I told you, a broader audience, since you focused on more well-known novels. I think we're gonna have an interesting discussion. I would like to take the premise of making the first question, since I'm starting it. My question would be, I would like to start with something that I really liked it about your book, the way you described your methodology. We have been working a lot with close reading as a strategy of going back to form and going back to the novel structure and to the material of the novel and to the how it is constructed, in a kind of a formalist attempt at like regaining form as a topic of study. And in your book, you term your methodology as medial reading. It's not far, it's not close. And so if you could expand a bit on that. I think we will all be very curious about this methodological aspect of your research. I think it's a general interest for all of us.
Yeah, thank you, Priscilla. Part of the part of what I guess I was getting at with this concept of medial reading was that I was encountering sort of I feel committed to the formalist project of reading, doing literary history without generals, right? So by which I mean not so much that we should throw Pushkin and Dostoevsky from the ship of modernity, but include them all, throw them all in, and see what happens, and attempt to produce a kind of corpus, to generate a kind of corpus of texts that maybe are united not by their greatness or their secondariness either, but rather by a kind of social stratum and the kind of preoccupation that coming from that very specific kind of social stratum might arise. And so I didn't want to do case studies, which of course is what 3 or 4 case studies, which is what we are usually trained to do when it comes to close readings. I didn't want to, but I also didn't want to do distant reading, because I believe that what is happening with form is something that requires a lot of attention and is extremely minute and is dynamic, right? Again, another formalist conception, the conception of dynamic form. In other words, that there are these warpings or deformations that are constantly taking place, and that's where form really is. And so this is kind of how I set things up. The reason why not close, even though some of the chapters contain somewhat close readings, was precisely because I wanted to cover a lot, relatively a lot, and I wanted to see patterns of dynamism, a particular kind of dynamic that itself is patterned, and it seemed to me that distant reading is kind of flattening and de-dynamizing. Paradoxically enough, even if it linearizes it, right? Even if it projects it on a kind of chronological scale, first we have this, and then we have this, and then we have this, it doesn't have the capacity to look at what's happening with these deformations and warpings on the one hand. And close reading tends to another thing that with close reading is that it tends to either, in my mind, is that it tends to either focus on either kind of go back to the unspoken, almost new critical assumption of the organic work of art, or conversely, of a kind of deconstructive vision, right? A kind of attempt to see how things don't work. And I believe neither in the organic work of art. I don't believe in the organic work of art, but I believe or I understand what is taking. I'm interested in the relationship between form and material and social formation, right? As I said, a kind of somewhat historical materialist questions that I'm asking. And from that point of view, a deconstructive or kind of close reading that doesn't sort of step back and sees the larger patterns also feels unsatisfying. I'm not sure if I quite address this question, but this is what comes to mind.
Sure. Yeah. Great. Thank you for the answer. And also, you were very much worried about critical reception of the works you have chosen, besides like working with this bigger authors of political sciences or philosophy, which were all very important references for your analysis, but you were attentive to the response. And I think, was this how you tried to grasp this dynamic functioning of the novel as it was born, right?
You mean sort of critical reception, immediate critical reception of texts, right?
Yeah, because I mean the first chapter on Belinsky is just amazing, because we know what Belinsky means to Russian literature in the 19th century. I mean, you don't do anything without having some response from him, and that would be like define pretty much your destiny as a novelist back then. And I think it was interesting that was your main entrance, right, to this.
Yeah.
You started off with not with the novels themselves, but with this big critic that was like the main.
Right. Belinsky reading Hegel, right? So yeah. So that is a kind of a first deformation, right? The first moment at which certain things are suddenly invisible in Hegel's philosophy of right, right, and other things are highlighted, and yeah. So
was this really the starting point of the whole thing, the research? Did you realize that in Belinsky, and then you started doing analyzing the novels, or? If I don't know if it matters much, but I'm just curious.
It was a little bit like this. I was working simultaneously with Belinsky, with Herzen, and with Goncharov. Early Herzen, and with early Goncharov, and with those three, suddenly kind of things came together in a sort of way that started sounding familiar, started sounding. It started sounding like a paradigm to me, and examples started occurring, right? Other cases started occurring, and of course the idea is not to sort of pile up examples, but rather to use these texts in order to kind of expand the area of this symbolic activity, right? While it is still in some way delimited in particular way, right? It seems to me that the text should be used in order to kind of test the limits of these of the paradigm, right? Without destroying it, hopefully.
Sure, and of course, I think it's a big contribution, your reading of the role of the state, basically, and sovereignty and everything, and how it was a formative principle in Russian novels from the 19th century. And I think it's new because we were always used to reading about how religion was basically. I think in the beginning, when Russian novels were started being received abroad, like religion seemed to be the thing that made Russian realism different from European code and atheist realism. And I couldn't quite understand. I know it was not your interest, but how would you, apart from the fact that the Tsar is related to the whole empire is related to religion by its constitution, but how do you put in this puzzle this piece, right? Religion, and how important it is and how it is integrated. Is it already embedded in state? When you were talking about types of aggregation, I couldn't help but thinking about Sabornost, this concept that was so important for Dostoevsky himself and for the Slavophiles back then, which is this type of Hegelian, right, aggregation. That's very, it's like the individual is not opposed to the collective, and
exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, something quite right. Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Priscilla. You were.
No, this was the question. So I don't know if I missed it, but did you expand? Did you talk about subordinates somewhere, or is religion somehow integrated in your framework of seeing the novel, the Russian novel, as this dynamics between state and the people?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for this question. So there are two ways to answer this. One thing to say is that it isn't so. So the kind of aside from some of the obvious things, especially when I talk about political theology, I don't go to historical studies of Russian religion, 19th century Russian religious thought, right? So that's kind of not a horizon with which I am familiar, and is not one with that I am kind of integrating into my work. But nevertheless, the concept of subordinacy, and specifically the concept of that I kind of borrow from Hegel and from Belinsky's reception of Hegel, the concept of the substance or the substantive as a social modality is kind of deeply linked precisely to this idea of subordinate, and makes its way into the question of the state or of the political in the form not of dramatic sovereign exercises of power, but in the form of the questions of belonging, the common good, right? The other side of the state, which makes it so so ambiguous, precisely, right? So belonging, the state as a kind of privileged site of belonging in the Russian context, in the Russian kind of within that social imaginary, and within these texts, the state as a site of belonging is the state of subordinate, right? Is this state of togetherness, idealized togetherness, and that question of the substantive is something that necessarily comes up quite a bit in the text, in particular in my discussions of Herzen, but also elsewhere. So religion directly no, but indirectly through the concept of the substantive, very much yes, yeah. There was one other thing that I wanted to mention, but I have now forgotten it. I'm sorry.
No problem. If you remember later, we can go back to it. It was very interesting hearing you talk about Peter the Great and how it was implicit in many passages of Crime and Punishment, but it was explicit in Dostoevsky's speech on Pushkin, right? And there, I mean, hearing you and going back to that, it's crystal clear how he was saying that, yeah, Peter the Great was an expression of the Russian nationality, of the fate, of the destiny of the Russian people to integrate the whole world in subordinates, right? So yeah, it makes total sense. I could talk nonstop, but please, my friends, can join the conversation.
I've actually been enjoying your discussion. So if you want to go on, it's fine, because I have very general questions. So I'll let Thiago go first.
Okay, thank you, Julia. Thank you first, Ilya, for your extremely thought-provoking talk, of acting like a student here, furiously taking notes of what you, on your talk. But I'd like to have a sort of more or less methodological question, is how is your approach is complicated or complexified by the fact that in Russia, the novel is not a homegrown but an imported genre. Okay, if I recall, in The Political Unconscious, Jameson states that the novel lands in Russia as a fully formed, fully developed, fully institutionalized genre. Unlike in Britain, the novel does not need to jockey for prestige and recognition in Russia. It is already acknowledged as an international genre. Such status thus allows the novel, I think, to tackle big themes, big issues like war and peace, in a way that Jameson argues that it cannot and that it could not do in Britain. The novel has a much more modest scope in Britain than it had in Russia. So my question is informed by Jameson's insight or sweeping generalization. How does the belatedness of the novel in Russia thus shapes its devices, techniques, and narrative strategies, its capacity to tackle this elusive relationship between the state and civil society? Sorry for more rather rambling.
No. Thank you. This is a question very much close to my heart, and this allows me also to invoke a Brazilian critic whom I dearly love, Roberto Schwartz, who, of course, in Misplaced Ideas, when he talks about Machado, he brings up the Russian novelistic tradition as a kind of similarly, precisely because of its belatedness. I think he emphasizes the belatedness part, and he says precisely because of this belatedness, the Russians were in the position to be much more skeptical about the sorts of kind of middle class values that were being promoted by, in some cases, Victorian and other European novels. So that's one way of seeing belatedness. There is, I think that there is another way of understanding it, which, and I keep trying to kind of wrangle my way out of a kind of linear reasoning here, linear historical reasoning here. And the way that I tend to do it is in terms of thinking about the various spaces in which the novel shows up, in terms of their social formations. So rather than thinking that the Russians have not developed a civil society, just thinking, right, what does this look like, instead of what it's missing. And from that point of view, I think that the novel's appearance in Russia is just another case of this, right? So more predominantly for me is the question of, the question of prestige, I think, is important. I do think that when it comes to prestige, the Russians had a very hard time producing the novel for 2 decades after Balzac, right? Balzac was already there, and there's a lot of interesting work written about this. Victoria Somov's book on omniscience and the development of the omniscient narrator in Russia, that was quite difficult and quite complicated. But I think it's fair to say that when it emerges, it is immediately the most prestigious genre. And maybe there is a case, I'm sorry, I'm kind of rambling and thinking out loud. Maybe there is a case to be made for the fact that it is open to other issues. But then the question is, what other issues, right? There's a kind of vague humanistic air to this claim, which says, okay, they can talk about God, they can talk about life and death, and so on and so forth. yeah, I mean, maybe, but then the question is, how do they talk about God and about life and death? And suddenly, right, once one begins to specify things, then there is a bit more of a sense of what are the actual preoccupations. And I'm also kind of interested in the way, and this I was listening with so much interest to your discussion of the work that Ivana Piric is doing, right, or Piric, and thinking about the political, right, and the way in which how does one approach the question of the political in the novel, in the context of the novel. And it seems to me that right, there's a very narrow definition of the political that goes back to I would say Hegel, but more immediately to somewhat unpalatable character like Carl Schmitt, and on the other side of the spectrum, or somewhere else on the spectrum, someone like Hannah Arendt, who are really insistent in separating the political from the social. And I don't go with them that far, right? I don't think there's such a thing as a distinctly political thing that's totally pure of the social. My discussion of Marx's critique of the philosophy of right, I think, is what this is about. Namely, they're always contaminating each other. But I think that in the abstract, it is useful to be able to distinguish them at times, sort of tactically. And I think that especially in the Russian, especially today, it seems to me the question of the political and the question of sovereignty is something that comes out. The question of post-hegemony. This is why I kind of entitled it "Dominance Without Hegemony," following Ravsanjit Guha's title of his the great subaltern studies scholar Guha, who himself borrows this from Gramsci, right? So are we dealing today with dominance, with a kind of reemergence of the dominance without hegemony paradigm? And from that point of view, I think the Russian novel becomes very resonant with other points, not just with today, but with other historical moments, among them the historical moments in which it was initially received, right? Going back to Priscilla's question, the historical moments in which, again, hegemony seems to collapse, and we are once again in a kind of critical moment of truth situation in which the question of power becomes extremely precious, extremely important. So I mean, there's a lot here. So from a certain point of view, right, then this is the last section of the book, which I kind of somewhat ironically call précis, because it's actually longer than any other section of the book. But in there, right, there's this idea, there's this historical poetics question, the question of historical poetics, namely, why so many tragic motifs, why so much tragedy suddenly in the novel, not a la realist tragedy paradigm or tragic realism paradigm, but in the sense of a kind of strata of genre memory that becomes actualized or reactualized at particular historical moment or within the particular social formation. Why? Because tragedy is, of course, all about the paradoxes of sovereignty, right? Traditionally, right? This is what tragedy is, and right, and so therefore there's this infusion of the tragic, of the novel by the tragic. I will stop here because I don't know where I'm going with this.
Can I articulate just one more question? And what is the interplay between what you call this? I love this expression, the sort of genre memory, okay, which which I find hugely illuminating, because literature has a memory. It harkens back to works that were previously published and are more or less widely read and discussed. But what is the interplay between this specifically Russian genre memory in a more cosmopolitan international genre memory? Because when the very notion of the novel has a national and it has a cosmopolitan, international, transnational tradition. And how do we conceptualize, how do we grasp, how do we analyze this interplay between a localized, nationally inflected genre memory and a more cosmopolitan, multi-secular, transnational genre memory? You know, I'm acting like a student here because.
Can I add something to Thiago's question, because that has to do with what I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very general question, and probably because of my ignorance of Russian literature. But I think it has to do with what Thiago was saying, especially because I very much liked the text that you suggested for us to read for your talk, which precisely talks about this idea of dynamics, of how the genres, right, are continuously changing, and it's, we should actually think about the genres through these changes, rather through the way that somehow they seem stabilized. So my question has to do with this notion of the local and the global, I think, in terms of how, even though the novel is imported as a genre, the Russians are some of the first to experiment so much with the form that this kind of, that the novel, the form of the novel is somehow, let's say, returned to Europe in a way that Europeans don't really know what to do with it. And this is also striking and I think very important for the ways that British, German, French literature not develops, but rather changes throughout the end of the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So can you talk a little bit about that? About how the novel, Thiago talked about how the novel was imported, but I want to talk about this kind of exportation of this Russian experimentalism, which I find extremely interesting.
Yeah, this is all of the questions you are raising are questions that kind of haunted me while I was writing this text, as in, like, shouldn't you be addressing this too? Right? And but sort of, so I'm so glad that you're pointing at the limits of this investigation, and and especially the question of what happens on the other end, right? I was reminded, as you were speaking, Julia, of Yuri Lotman's idea that the different semiospheres, right, occupy these different positions relative to each other, right? So there's a period of reception, right, when the kind of culture or semiosphere receives all of these texts, and then it produces, and then it starts transmitting, right, back to. And so it would be really fascinating to me, British modernism and the Russian novel is of course a really prominent, and some work has been done on it. It's experimentation. I think it is what the modernists perceive in the Russian novel, and going back again to Priscilla's point, is earlier point about right, the way that the texts were received even at the end of the 19th century, even not in the 20th century. What is perceived about the texts, these Russian texts, is an interest in the sacred, right, or a kind of sacredness of the genre, right, or sacralization of the genre, resacralization of this extremely secular genre of all genres, the most secular genre, right? The idea that somehow these novels are really myths, or that they are tragedies, right? That there is something kind of something, right? The words used would be archaic, barbaric, right? Some of the words that are not necessarily ones that we would endorse, but nevertheless, there is somehow a sense of a kind of return of the novel, of the secular, somewhat fallen art form, which is kind of almost viewed as somewhere in between entertainment and art, somewhere, right, somewhere a bit too close to the market, right? All of these problems with the novel suddenly is returned as high art, finally, right? And now you can be Virginia Woolf or James Joyce, right? And now you can think, and again, I'm not doing this in any causal way, but somehow my sense is that this is what gets communicated through these texts. And my argument would be, if I had to make it, is that the genres that deal with the political happen to also have this kind of aura, right? The political theological. In other words, what is the political, right? So something happens to Oedipus. It's not just happening to Oedipus, the individual, right? It is happening to not just the entire royal house, but the entire city of Thebes, right? And the history of the city of Thebes. And Oedipus is not an individual, right? Nietzsche says the Greeks could not tolerate individuals on the tragic scene, right? Because Oedipus is not an individual. He is a kind of point of articulation of social and historical forces, right? Social and historical curses that, right, that persist and so on. So something, right? And for, invoking Durkheim for a moment, just to kind of indicate the extent to which the polity and the divine are tied together, so closely together. The idea of the political and the divine are always side by side with each other, and God is just other people, right? And one's own shape of relationship to other people. That seems to be a relevant thing as well. Weber, sociologists or early 20th century sociologists are also fascinated with the Russian novel for reasons that aren't that dissimilar. The Cambridge School of myth studies, of myth and ritual studies, who were very close to the Virginia Woolf, to the Bloomsbury circle, right? They were really interested in the Russian novel and thought of it as ritualistic, mythical, tragic, right? I believe one of them, Jane Harrison. I'm stepping now into an area with which I'm not very familiar, but I believe Jane Harrison actually started studying Russian because she was so taken by this Russian stuff. So there's a lot of work to do there, but these are just kind of approximate thoughts about what might be happening. Maybe too approximate. Yeah, and going back to Tiago's question about the national and the cosmopolitan. Again, so my interest in there's some way in which this formula might be useful. So novel in a particular place is a global thing happening in a local way, right? So if we can keep both of these in mind, then we can start asking various questions. Like, for example, in Russia, famously, the world famous Balzac didn't particularly produce enthusiasm. Who produced a lot of enthusiasm? George Sand, who, right, as we know, George Sand, for the French even, right, but I mean, Margaret Cohen's work in this regard is still the classic, right? That the whole sentimentalist tradition, French sentimentalist women's fiction tradition, is wiped off the face of the earth by these robust, male-centered realist dudes, right? And so and so, but in the Russian context, George Sand is, as Dostoevsky calls her, what does she call it? Female Christ, right? I mean, she's just worshipped by the Russians. And so then there's the question of, okay, why is the novel happening locally here, interested in that other author who is actually not so happening locally in that place, but is actually interesting nevertheless much more. And again, I have some hypotheses about specifically George Sand and the sentimental tradition, but yeah, just to limit it to this issue. Also, there are some very curious things about translating Balzac into Russian. Translation from that point of view is extremely interesting space, especially in the 19th century when they are not particularly worried about accuracy, but are very happy to rewrite texts. So, for example, Balzac's very famous Père Goriot, remember how it ends, right, with Rastignac being on top of the cemetery proclaiming, and now I challenge, and he goes to Delphine, right? He makes the Delphine Nucingen choice. In the Russian case, Rastignac makes the opposite choice. He goes to Victorine, right? And as the editor of this Russian translation comments, this is a translation of the novel not as it was written, but as it should have been written. So pathological, curious cases like that can be very informative.
Tiago, Julia, do you want to add something?
No, I'm so sorry, but I really have to leave just because I have to pick my kids up from school. But but it's been an amazing talk, and I really hope that you guys continue with the discussion. I'm going to watch the rest of it later. I'm so sorry, Ilya.
No problem at all. No problem.
Mom duties now.
Yes.
Okay.
Totally understood.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you so
nice
much.
To meet you.
And I'll watch the rest of it afterwards. Thank you.
Bye-bye, Julia.
Bye.
So I think we have some questions from the audience, don't we?
Yeah.
Please, as a mediator.
I think we have like one first here.
Yeah.
Is Jurandir Albuquerque is asking, how can we talk about, I think you have touched this topic already, but again, we can go back to it. How can we talk about civil society in a
I did not hear you for some reason. Oh, it's because I pressed something. I'm sorry. Would you say this again?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so Jurandir is asking, it's something I think you have already touched upon, but we can go back to this. How can we talk about civil society in an authoritarian country like Russia in the 19th century?
Right. Well, that's exactly the point, right? We can't, right? And so, but nevertheless, the novel as it appears, right? And this is one way in which the point is how is something global happening locally, right? The global kind of novelistic coding, so civil society coding that with which it is imbued, right? The social imaginaries of civil society show up in Russia and have a hard time being made sense of, right? And Belinsky again is this classic example, like he doesn't know what to do with civil society because he wants to apply things to life, and he doesn't want to just philosophize. And when he tries to apply it to life or to art, he realizes we don't have that. We have something else. We have a different thing. So yeah, I was reminded also of Tiago's point about genre memory. I just wanted to direct you to mention that this is a concept that shows up in Bakhtin's text a couple of times in his Dostoevsky Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics. So that has two editions, right? The second edition, where he adds a chapter on plot. That's where the concept of genre memory appears. And of course, he just, as is so often with brilliant Bakhtin, he just throws it out, and we are supposed to guess what it means. And And so, yeah, so that's, sorry, just.
Thank you.
Good, thank you. Another question we have here from the audience is when you were talking about Raskolnikov, I think this was the context, and Fluffy Bernardo says that something very curious in your reading is that the crisis of the character happens in public, not in private, as if it is as if the power of the state or of the police ended up with a distinction between public and private. It's just like a comment. I don't know if you wanted to add something on it, but.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And here's where I think this is a great point, and I think that what seems to be happening here is precisely this distinction between, Rancière would draw the distinction between the political and the police, and I kind of also want to draw it, even though somewhat slightly differently, but right, because as far as the police is concerned, the crime has to be hidden, right? Because from the point of view of the police, right, if your relationship as a criminal is to the police, then you have to hide. But if your relationship as a criminal is to a foundational act, right, if it takes place within the imaginary of sovereignty, then it has to be open, right? It cannot be hidden. Did Napoleon hide his crimes against humanity? No, he took pride of them. Did Peter hide his cruelties? No. And on the contrary, these cruelties defined him. And so that's the contradiction that Raskolnikov then experiences. On the one hand, he's pulled towards the disciplinary, the police, right, within which he's supposed to hide. And on the other hand, he's pulled in his own mind, right, towards the sovereign, in which case he's supposed to do everything in public and be acclaimed.
Exactly why. Sorry.
No.
Exactly why it's not a whodunit novel, right? It cannot be, right? Although it works with these devices, it plays with it. It makes you believe that it's going to be like a crime story, but it never is in the end, right?
Right. Yeah. So it's like this, and then it's like this, right?
Right. And also, again, Jonathan made a very good question, and I'm looking forward to hear your response to it. He asks, the continuity of a strong state of the Tsar time to the Bolshevik time, does it take to continuities between fiction pre and post revolution? I know it's a broad question, but yeah, if you can say some words about it.
No, thank you. Yeah, because all three of my ghosts, right, as I was working on this, right, shouldn't I also write about modernism? Yeah, I think that absolutely it's there. It absolutely continues, but it's quite curious because I think sometimes it is displaced by it is rendered more abstract. It seems to me that it is often rendered more abstract, where the individual is participating in a kind of project, which is call it a socialist state building project, and the individual is always aware of that. I mean, I'm thinking of Platonov for some reason right now, obviously, but the individual is always aware of being a participant of that state project, and it's almost like, the formalists were curiously interested in the 18th century, right, in the ode and all of that stuff. And I think that the 20th century kind of relationship to the state, as in, let us build the culture of the state, right? That's a kind of 18th century service elites approach, right? So the service elites are introducing the idea of and the monarch is introducing the idea of the state as the agent of enlightenment, right? And the cultural actors must promote this idea as a state of enlightenment. And then you enter into contradictions and problems. Is this enlightened enough? Is this not enlightened enough? And so on. And I think that something like this happens in the 20th century, in the kind of first 20 in the 1920s, where there's always this question of what is the enlightened, the socialist, the proper, right? have we come to a limit where we should not be crossing, and so on and so forth. So there's a question of what does socialist culture looks like, as opposed to what tends to happen in the 19th century, I think, and that is the question of this kind of dualism, right? Either I am the sovereign or I am standing in front of the sovereign, right? And the kind of individuation of the figure of the state, personification of the state in the figure of the civil servant or the criminal or right whoever else. That I think we have less of that in Soviet modernism when it comes to novels. But I am definitely, I haven't thought about it closely enough, and I'm definitely happy to hear what other people think about this, because I don't, whether Priscilla or Tiago or anybody else.
I'm a lay person
Definitely,
here.
it seems more.
Definitely what?
It's more. It's definitely more abstract, right? Less personalized. The whole thing of the state in Soviet times. I think it's like more like a super.
Right. It's very personal. It's very personal, but it's not personified.
Right? Exactly. Yeah. I think I would go in this direction of your insight, but I couldn't add much. I don't know. I think Tiago wanted to name a work, right, Tiago? When you were talking about characters that are meant to be czars, right, Tiago?
Yeah. While I was speaking, it came. I immediately. I was able to undig from the depths of my memory that delicious short story by Rudyard Kipling, The Man Who Would Be King, where those two loafers they leave India and go to Kafiristan. It's a tale of imperial folly.
Serious, right? And Lord Jim, right? Conrad's
Lord Jim as well. Lord Jim as well by Conrad. Yeah.
So this is very interesting that you have this modernist thing, and of course colonial thing, right? Because right, where
Nostromo, can you Nostromo as well by Conrad,
right?
Nostromo as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Where can one be king, right? One can be king. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. Thank you. And in general, yet another thing kind of hovering around, right, is the question of the post-colonial novel, right? And the fact that I'm drawing the title of the talk, at least from the from Guha, kind of gestures at that fact. And again, something to explore, maybe.
I was happy to hear you mentioning Ivana Perica's talk, our previous talk, because I think we are really having a very coherent year this year, right, Tiago? Like the talks are well integrated into one another. The next one we're gonna discuss what is to be done by Chernyshevsky. So I think we're still in the political topic somehow.
Fantastic. And is that in English going to be, or?
No, it's a Brazilian, Brazilian scholar who wrote his doctoral thesis about the novel. So unfortunately, I don't know if there's a way of simultaneous. I have seen videos on YouTube that were dubbed, but I don't know how this magic happens. So, anyways, thank you very much. Sorry.
ChatGPT.
I think. I mean, it seems that they can do everything, but recently I've been trying to do very easy things, and it's not working well yet. So I don't know how efficient it really is so far. Anyways, I think we can close, right, Tiago? We don't have more questions from the audience. I think it was very, very interesting, Ilya. Thank you very much for your participation. I think it was productive for all of the people who followed, and it will be recorded so people can go back to it and rewatch or watch it for the first time. And I
hope to join in the audience.
Thank you.
Good. Excellent.
Sometime in the future.
We'll get back next month. So people stay in tune. We're going to be spreading the word about our next talk soon. And thank you, Thiago, for being with us.
Thank you, Ilya. That was, was
so much.
wonderful, very illuminating talk. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.